Welcome to the Renegade Report. I'm Jonathan.
And Ramon is present. And Jonathan, I must be honest, I'm quite happy today because I've been elevated by the Daily Maverick, or someone who writes on it, not as an alt-right scumlord racist, but he called me an intellectual.
Yes, he did call you an intellectual, but it is coming from Ismail Lagardin, I think, is the pronunciation of his name.
I mean, I didn't want to give him publicity, and now you just ruined it.
Well, that's fine. We won't call him an intellectual. I don't think he is one. But yeah, I mean, he can call you an intellectual, and I don't think that's very high praise where it comes from. But you can take it, Ramon. That's the best you can get at the moment. What can we say?
Well, listen, he called me an intellectual because he was speaking about our very guest today, Helen Zille.
He's very upset.
Yes, and he's very upset that we form part of the same intellectual spheres. Helen Zille, ex or Premier of the Western Cape, and now Senior Policy Fellow at the Institute of Race Relations. Helen, thank you so much for joining us on this Tuesday evening.
Pleasure, Ramon. Pleasure, Jonathan. Nice to see you, Jonathan.
Yeah, you too.
I've already said hello to Ramon, so obviously it's nice to see him.
So I'm sure you stick to death of this question, Helen, but let's just get out of the way right now. IR, liberal think tank. Why would a liberal join a liberal think tank? I mean, it's quite baffling to me, but from the horse's mouth, I think we should hear why.
Well, a liberal would join a liberal think tank because liberal ideas are as endangered today as they ever were in our country. There is a huge hegemony of homogenous thought that gets imposed upon society as the politically correct way to think. And the small group of us who really believe in core freedoms need to promote those freedoms wherever we possibly can. And there is no better way to do it than to multiply our forces and to do different things from the same guiding principle, which is the rights and the touchstone of each individual and the pursuit of freedom in a context that can create opportunity through economic growth. That's what we all stand for, and that's why I'm part of the team.
That's excellent. But I think the criticism, obviously, that you're getting from a lot of people is, well, obviously, it's a straw man. I think we can both agree, but the IRR is a racist organization. It stands for whatever white interests or the interests of whatever buzzword is popular today, monopoly capital or foreign interests or third forces or whatever you want to throw out there. And I think in the article Ramon was referring to, where he was so kindly referred to as an intellectual, the point being made is, well, now you're throwing in your hat with the people you've always been accused of being a part of. You've always been part of the cabal of racists, and it could never really be pinned on you because you seem to be doing all this stuff in the Western Cape, and not all the people there are white. So it was a bit of she's a white supremacist who also doesn't hate black people and colored people. But now it's proven. Now you are part of the Institute of Race Relations, and it's a fait accompli.
Shame, it's such a pathetic argument. All assertion and no evidence. I feel sorry for people who have to just label others and smear others without any analysis behind it. The truth is that to be a committed non-racist today is somehow, in the most perverted sense, to be racist. This is the extraordinary doublethink and perversion of analysis that we get. So the idea is that if you genuinely believe in non-racialism and want to apply it and live it, somehow that makes you a racist in modern day South Africa. And this extraordinary shift from having been seen as almost communist 30 years ago to being with the mainstream of non-racialism in the early 90s, which was a fabulous place to be because non-racialism was progressive for a very short window period. And now to believe in non-racialism and non-racism and inclusion means that you're racist because you're not seeing race, and it's actually a microaggression, is an extraordinary example of doublethink. And I pity people who think in that way. You can't get away from racism by applying racism. If you don't want to apply racism, there's a simple way of doing it, and that is to stop applying racist criteria.
Well, yes. I mean, it is that simple form for many people, and I think quite a few people will agree with you on that premise. But what does it say, Helen? I wanted this a bit later in the conversation, but it's probably more prudent now to talk about it. The election that happened now in May, it shows that people are sort of retreating to silos in a way. There's very little battle about ideas anymore. It seems to be more about identity, what I can get from the state, and fear. Why is there regression, or maybe there never was progress towards liberalism in the first place in South Africa? But there seems to be a marked regression from liberal ideas, generally speaking, even through the state institutions, the courts, they prosecuting people for hate speech left, right, and center. Unless that person is black, then they sort of have a different test for it. BE is on the march. The Competition Act allows for racial quotas all over the place. I know the ANC is not non-racial, but why do you think society is reflecting more broadly what the ANC wants?
That's a very interesting question. And I think it is true that the tendency for people around superficial biological characteristics to band together is a very powerful one. It's an ancient one. It's almost instinctive reaction, probably in our genes for the purposes of survival initially. The far more advanced one that comes through fighting entropy and developing the essence of humanity is to identify with people around ideas and around principles and around policy. But that takes some evolution in thinking and analysis and a perception of how societies can best be governed and how ideas can be contested, and that it really is about ideas and policies and not race. But that takes a time to evolve. Now, we were on the road in the 1990s. I genuinely think we were. I think that that is the major contribution that President Mandela made to our society, in which he argued very convincingly that we were all South Africans and had to build one nation. I don't think he for a moment underestimated the challenge of it, but he put us on the road. As the other ANC's policies, particularly cadre deployment and bringing race into the economy so forcefully, and then bringing state capture from the earliest days of cadre deployment, in which the party captured institutions of state and then inevitably saw the unraveling of the economy and more unemployment, which rose from 3.6 million in 1994 to over 10 million and rising today, there had to be a scapegoat. And when policies are failing and when governments are failing, they have to find someone to blame. They can't say, look, it's our policies that are messing up. We're creating a total shambles here. Our policies aren't working. The whole BBBEE is only benefiting a tiny small elite, less than 1% of the population. It's destroying state institutions and destroying the economy. They will never say that. So what do? They look for a small minority to blame, and the whites are an obvious target, Indians as well. Because by and large, white people have benefited from past economic growth, and the solution is much more economic growth, much more confidence in the future. We don't have a stagnant economy that has to be parceled out in a zero-sum game. But instead of being able to follow policies that will grow the economy, they prefer to say the reason that you are poor is because of whites. The reason that you are poor is because white people own this economy, which is of a certain size. And unless we take it away from them and give it to you, ditto the land, you will always be poor. So it becomes a conscious strategy to mobilize around race, which is, of course, a complete red herring, because if all whites were somehow wished away from South Africa or driven out of South Africa, the economy would be much worse, education would be much worse, poverty would be much worse. So it's a complete red herring argument, but it finds traction with this kind of instinctive biological thing that we all have to kind of gravitate to our own in moments of crisis. And that's why it's so hard. And that's why the race card in a society like ours is the easiest thing to play. It's also the cheapest card to play. And that is why it's so difficult for people to see beyond it. I hope I've answered your question.
Yeah, I think you have quite broadly. In fact, both things I think were touched on there. One is using this as a formal policy, but the reality is, as a policy, its race policy has been a complete failure in this country and pretty much anywhere else in the world. It's been tried, and in fact, when you institute government policy to exclude any part of the population, it generally doesn't work out very well. So I think we know that. I think you also spoke to the fact that it's essentially an election tactic, and we know this. The ANC has openly in 2 previous elections now admitted using the race card and race politics to win the election. Why do you think, though, that people, beside for sort of an evolutionary in-group bias, why do you think people are so drawn to this in South Africa? Is it just a historical thing? Is it I wonder our education system, how that's playing into people's ability to reason through these arguments. We often talk about around elections, why would anyone revote this government in? We just had an election a few months ago, and the election before that, everyone was like, well, we'll kind of give the ANC another chance. Zuma had already been a disaster for a period of time, and a lot of people felt, no, we'll give them kind of another chance. And now with Cyril, it was give them another chance, and things will be better. And I would be willing to bet that, come 2024, the same sort of rhetoric will abound. We will have people who are traditional ANC voters or expect certain areas to vote in that way being told, let's give them another chance. What is the sort of attraction to not only these race politics, but continuously voting for almost catastrophe?
Yes, that's a very, very challenging question, but I must answer and say that it is not only in South Africa. Now that multiculturalism has come to Europe, you're seeing very, very much the same reaction. You're seeing Brexit being driven. You're seeing walls being built or threatened to being built along the Mexican border. You're seeing people saying, stay out. Don't touch us on our patch. And it is a very, very big dilemma. I mean, South Africa hasn't got an option. We're a democracy. We're all South Africans, we all live here, and we have to somehow make it work. And for a brief period in the 1990s, we thought that we could make that happen. And then the regression through bad government and scapegoat seeking has been a great, great tragedy. And we've also lost our opportunity to be a kind of test tube for the world to show how it can be done, because that's how it must be done in a shrinking world. So I don't think it is only South Africa. I think it is dramatically so many other countries, and it is very few countries that manage to overcome that, if any, so far. So that is our huge challenge. Can we enable the politics of ideas and argument and debate and principles and policy supersede race and superficial biological characteristics?
Well, I mean, sorry, just one thought.
Sure.
How do you, Helen? I mean, I sort of agree with you with the ideas, having ideas and debate and arguments and the Socratic method in public life. But at what stage do we say that, we've tried our best, maybe it's time to let people, do something else entirely? Maybe in-group preference should be something that should be maintained and protected, and we just, live in our own little separate groups and try to trade with each other. Maybe that will solve more conflict than trying to sort of integrate everyone under an umbrella system of sorts.
Well, that sounds to me like what Verwoerd tried. He said if every ethnic group has their own little country in Southern Africa, we can trade and we can get on with each other, but we don't have to live in a political context where one group can be dominated by another. That was basically the scheme of grand apartheid, which I rejected, and which obviously could not be implemented without grave, grave injustices. So we are an omelette in South Africa. We absolutely are. And we cannot unscramble the egg without really violating human rights. And we have a single economy, which makes it impossible to move people around to be in different countries and hope that somehow an economy will grow in various smaller entities. With a single economy, you can't have a different polity. And that is why the whole European experiment is so interesting, because they don't have a single fiscal system, which means it's impossible to have a single economy, which is why you can still hold out with these different separate countries. But that's, of course, under huge threat, which is why you're seeing the backlashes that you're seeing all over Europe. So we don't have the option of unraveling. You can see, for example, how in Spain, around Barcelona, the community there really wants to secede. The Catalans want to secede and get on with their own country. It's very, very difficult to start redrawing boundaries. I do think that we have a country that can only succeed in terms of the policies and the principles that we espouse. I'm also under no illusion that it will take a very long time. Liberalism is the politics of the long haul. And although liberal parties per se, with a capital L, aren't usually very successful around the world, the basic architecture of successful countries is a liberal architecture. The notion of the rights and freedoms of individuals, the right of free choice and free speech, contesting political parties, the separation of powers, those are all fundamentally liberal ideas. So even if liberal parties in those parts of the world perhaps don't triumph often, the greatest triumph is having liberal constitutions and liberal systems. And we have that in South Africa, but the battle to implement them, for example, independent state institutions, has only just begun. It is absolutely no coincidence that in a country like Britain, for example, it took 800 years to get from the Magna Carta to where they are now. And they are still grappling with these ideas. So for us liberals, we must understand that this is a struggle that started way before we were born and will continue way after we are dead, because we believe that it appeals to the highest qualities inherent in human beings, the capacity to transcend their biology and see things more broadly and enter into debates, etc. But we always default to biology, having to survive on this planet. And that is why it's kind of an intellectual evolution that we have to go through, and a social evolution, and an organizational evolution. And I wouldn't be there. I don't want to put myself above anybody else. I wouldn't be at this point if I didn't have the parents that I had, who'd been mightily oppressed in the country that they had to flee from, and really understood these values from first principles, and fought very hard for freedom for other people when they came to South Africa. So it's because I was brought up in that paradigm. I'm not claiming any brilliant insight on my own. Some people have those insights, even though they weren't raised in those paradigms. But it is a long, long struggle, and it's going to continue for way after we've been here. The point is to keep on that struggle and to leave the country more open, more free, more inclusive, and with a more rapidly growing economy than we found it.
You speak about the US and Europe, Brexit obviously going on there, the sort of tensions around immigration in the US and across the world. Actually, I think everyone's forgotten 2 million refugees that ended up across Europe from Syria. So I feel like we're kind of doing things a little bit backwards. So America is set up as a country around certain principles. So is the United Kingdom. So are most countries in Europe. You've got sort of these Lockean principles originally, and those sort of migrate everywhere. And so there's this undergirding idea of what makes up this country, what makes up this society, what we all believe in as a so-called nation. So in the United States, there's a lot of fracturing of that at the moment. But really, if you're, in my opinion, honest about it, it's because you've got a Republican and sort of middle of the road grouping of people who are still, for the most part, sticking to those original principles of what America kind of stands for. And then you've really got a Democratic Party moving far left in many respects, and basically adopting almost Soviet Leninist type principles in the way they view the world. And that's the clash that's currently happening. And I think that clash is happening because those are two principles that just don't meet. I'm not convinced in South Africa we have a set base of principles. I think we tried to sell a set base of principles around 94 to sort of 2000. We said, you know, we are one country with a rainbow nation. There was a lot of good branding of what we were and what our undergirding principles are. I worry about our constitution, frankly, because our constitution, if a classical liberal looks at it, they see it as a very good document. And if a communist looks at it, they also see it as a very good document. And that worries me, that it can be interpreted as such. Julius finds the constitution just as good as I do. And that's for me a problem. So I wonder if we're not doing things a little bit back to front in South Africa, and if our principles aren't really unknown, if we don't have a whole bunch of different principles, as Ramon's referring to, in sort of different nations who view things differently, and just really what is South African anymore? And I feel that the ANC is very happy to push that sort of division back apart. So broader, we all got brought together, and now we're kind of pulling apart at the seams.
Yes, John, the Constitution has its huge faults. There's no question about it. And everybody would say that from whatever perspective they're arguing. But it is the best we could do in a highly complex situation, and it is what we have got. And that is why I'm completely delighted that Julius Malema supports the Constitution. I also support the Constitution. If that is what brings us together, well, that's fantastic. If that is all we've got, and it is all that we have got, that is the platform on which we have to build South Africanism. And that is why I can't be more delighted that everyone from Julius Malema to Cyril Ramaphosa and to the Democratic Alliance, Mmusi Maimane and others, and the South African Institute of Race Relations, fights for the Bill of Rights and the ideas underpinning the Constitution. And we have to have big debates about them. We have to interpret them. We have to get the courts to set precedents around them. That's all part of the process of nation building. And we have to shortcut history. We have to do it in a much shorter time than, for example, the US did, and a much, much shorter time than a very established democracy like Britain did. Now, for example, all of these cases going on, they actually are enormously encouraging to me. Because the debate on the separation of the party and the state that is happening around state capture is happening in such a concentrated way that people really get that argument. I think most South Africans would get the idea that the public protector should not be an instrument of one faction of the ANC. And they would agree that the public protector needs to be completely independent and adjudicate according to the Constitution and the law without fear or favor. That idea took hundreds of years to take root in Britain and hundreds of years to take root in America. And here we are grappling with those and bringing them to fruition in a couple of decades. That is fantastic. Equally, the notion of a capable state. It wasn't too long ago that Britain used its civil service, end of the 19th century, that Britain used its civil service for cadre deployment, for rewards for pals, for connected individuals. It was a complete inefficient mess. It was a patronage network, very much like our civil service tragically has become. And in America, it wasn't much better. And it took decades for them to get to the point where they understood that a capable state is absolutely essential and that you have to have merit selection in a confined state and let the market, which has much more accountability because of consumers having choice, let the market drive as many things in society as possible. That took a damn long time to develop. Now in South Africa, we are having an intensive debate about the capable state. And we're having an intensive debate about cadre deployment and how that has ruined even the parts of the state that were capable before. And so these are debates that we must have, and liberals especially must prosecute, because we have to concentrate and concertina history. We have to go through in 10 years what Britain went through in a century.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I often think sometimes I oscillate between absolute despair on one hand, and then I'm like, on the other hand, well, we're doing a lot of things in a very, very swift way that took others a very long time to do. So maybe I'm a little bit unfair when I look at whatever election results and I think about, the people that would vote for the same sort of party that keeps them poor. So I think there is merit to that. point that you have made, Helen. But I think that Margaret Thatcher once said, constitutions are not written on pieces of paper, they're written on the hearts of each and every person in a society. I think that's the full quote. And I don't think that the concept of human rights in a constitutional way is as prevalent as we wish it to be. I think the education concerning what the Constitution is, what human rights are, what separation of powers are, is severely lacking. And obviously, it's not a South African problem. I mean, most Americans can't tell the difference between the legislature and the judiciary, and they are so-called first world. But I think, is there a lack of wanting to understand things, or is it a case of the ANC making sure that people don't really understand what human rights are according to the Constitution?
I think understanding constitutionalism is a huge challenge for any country. The rule of law is an easier concept, that everyone is equal before the law, and if the law says X, you do X. We have a much bigger problem in South Africa with the idea of respect for the rule of law. And I think that derives in some measure from the fact that it used to be in the past quite a mark of status, almost, to have a criminal conviction under the apartheid government. Now, I've even got a criminal conviction under the apartheid government, and I was quite proud of it. But the problem is, when you have broken down respect for the rule of law, it is damn difficult to build it again. Because people think, well, that's how it is, and it really goes from crossing the street where there's no crossing and dodging the traffic, which you will never see in countries that actually abide by the rule of law, to the terrible driving that you see on our roads, right through to thinking, well, if someone's left their cell phone here, I might as well pick it up and put it in my pocket and walk out, right through to the massive fraud that we see from Steinhoff to Eskom. So it is really very difficult to build up respect for the rule of law, and equally difficult, and sometimes more so, to build up respect for the right to life. And that, I often think, has partly to do with the history that we come from, but mainly to do with the fact, and I've got to be very, very careful here, but that there is not a comfortable fit between traditional systems of accountability and modern constitutional systems of accountability. And the hundreds of years of progress from what has been called an honor culture, where everybody was for themselves and their families and killed anybody who threatened them, to a dignity culture where you enable institutions of state to take that role over from you and respect the fact that you never take the law in your own hands. We've never actually been through that transition.
Yeah, no, fair point. And it will take a while before hopefully that happens, but we can't do it, unless the ANC loses power. So there's quite a lot of chatter on the chat here about Cyril Ramaphosa, about your personal opinions of him. I'm just going to give you mine so that you can look good. I think he's woefully incompetent. I think he is unable to save us, and I think he truly believes in the NDR. And he's a far more vociferous and dangerous person than Jacob Zuma, in my humble opinion, because he actually follows the rule of law, and he'll use the law to effect change to make South Africa the next Venezuela. I have no hesitation in saying that. But you, Helen, what are your thoughts on Cyril Ramaphosa and the effect that he will have on this country, if any?
I don't agree with your view, Ramon, but obviously I respect your right to hold it, and history will tell us which one is right. I think Cyril understands what is needed, but it is absolutely impossible on the basis that he stands on to do it. Once you have become a party of patronage, almost everyone in every position has a vested interest in keeping that network in place. And if your position depends on being supported by that network, you can't dare to break it up without putting your position in great jeopardy. So it wasn't a surprise that Cyril Ramaphosa said to the National Executive Council, or whichever meeting met this last weekend, the NEC, do your best to remove me next year at the big get-together that they have between conferences. He said, well, I dare you to take me out. But he knows very well that if he rocks the patronage network to the point that he threatens their economic benefits, they will not hesitate to take him out. For example, with Eskom, he knows exactly what he has to do. Years and years ago, there was a report that said the unbundling was absolutely critical. He made great mention of it when he first came to power, and we've never heard of it since. Why? Because the trade unions and the South African Communist Party do not want it. And he doesn't know what he's going to do to stay in power if there is a revolt from that quarter. So the bottom line is that Cyril is a captive of the ANC. And that is a patronage network that has formed its own cage that no one can break free from. And it really is immaterial whether or not he believes in the NDR or whether he doesn't, he cannot break free from that cage. The National Democratic Revolution argues that the party has to control the state, that the state has to control the economy. And of course, that is a recipe for disaster, but it is what gives rise to cadre deployment, state capture, and everything that goes with it. It's an inevitable consequence. It's not an accident. And it is going to be very, very difficult, if not impossible, for Cyril to take the action to unravel it. Tony Leon wrote a very good piece in last week's Sunday Times, in which he compared Cyril Ramaphosa and Boris Johnson. Now, Boris Johnson has a much freer hand, but he's basically said, this is what I'm going to do. He nails his colors to the mast. He gives a deadline, and he says, I'm going to do it, to hell with you all. And he's got a wafer-thin majority in the Conservative Party in Britain, a wafer-thin majority. Cyril Ramaphosa could never do that. So his primary objective is to hold the ANC together. And you can either save South Africa or hold the ANC together, but you cannot do both.
All right. So assuming that's the case and he chooses to hold the ANC together, then what's next? What happens? Because if he's going to hold the ANC together, and doing that, as you say, means cadre deployment, means government control of the economy, or attempted government control of the economy in all sectors. Does he succeed? Does the ANC fall apart in your view? Can we last another 5 years to an election where potentially another party takes control, or we have a multi-party democracy again? What does the future hold given those two roads?
Well, first of all, the ANC has been falling apart for a long time. Since Bantu Holomisa either was kicked out or left, I think it was a combination of the two, in the 1990s, there have been consistent splinterings and break-offs, and the big one was going to be COPE, but that failed, and then you saw the EFF emerge. So it's a continual process, and I think that will continue. I mean, we've seen Jimmy Manyi and the ATM. We've seen the pathetic attempt of Hlaudi Motsoeneng and various other people. So, this is a continuous process, and this slivering off is going to continue. The critical thing for us to do is to mobilize the forces that stand for our values, really to give South Africa a non-racial party that will stand firmly by those ideas and grow them and govern in some places to show the difference incrementally. I think more and more we will see coalitions develop. I think the DA is going to be face quite some challenge, especially in the Western Cape, with smaller parties also splintering off its base to form coalitions in local government elections, if I'm reading the trends right. And so managing coalitions to achieve outcomes is going to be incredibly, incredibly important. And those are difficult to manage. I've managed a very complex coalition in Cape Town with 7 political parties from right across the spectrum. And holding it together and getting some direction and achieving some results was perilously difficult. We managed to hold it together, fortunately, and we managed to take the next step to win the province. But it's going to take extraordinary leadership, I have to tell you, not to imply anything about myself, but there's an alchemy about keeping a coalition together and being able to achieve outcomes without the whole thing blowing apart in 5 minutes. So it's going to be very messy, Jonathan. It's going to be very, very messy. It's going to take real leadership, and it's going to take people of profound courage. If you want to be popular, this is not the place to be. If you want to default to the hegemony of the majority party or people who are dictating the terms, or the kinds of writers in Daily Maverick who want to label people for standing up to their values, well, you're going to be in a tough place. Anybody who has been able to make a breakthrough in history has been marginalized and taken a tough position in very, very complex space. The point is that if you get nearer to the reality over the long term, it becomes received wisdom, even though it was rejected at a particular point. And this is a long haul.
It's interesting. A lot of those points you make, I don't disagree at all. I do think you can be given kudos for managing that coalition in the Western Cape and for getting the DA where it was, ultimately to the fact that people trusted it as a government. My concern is it's almost like a race between the ANC slowly destroying everything they can get their hands on, and all of that happening. So it sounds quite optimistic when you say, these things will come together and there will be coalitions. And I know you've long been beating on this drum of we'll slowly take, if we have to take South Africa literally municipality by municipality, we'll take it municipality by municipality. And eventually the entire country will be run by people who know what they're doing and have the country's best interests at heart. But I do feel like, well, if you had that position 5 years ago, the Rand dollar was at 10-1, and you now hold that position at 15-1. And there's a point at which holding that position may still be the right position, but it's financially untenable. We're all poorer today than we were 10 years ago, regardless of how much money you've made. Relatively speaking, you are poorer. Those are things that definitely worry me. Coming from a health background, the NHI to me is pretty much the most catastrophic plan and policy the ANC has ever embarked on. So all of these things are rather concerning. And then just something I want to juxtapose to you, because I know you're not a big fan of the likes of Boris Johnson and Trump and others in the world who have risen to power. But Reagan was not popular when he rose to power in many senses, certainly not amongst the Daily Maverick of the United States and the people who write for them. He was not popular on the 702s of the United States, the NPRs and so on and so forth. And so, and history really reflects quite well on Reagan, and even the Democrats now sort of have respect for Reagan and what he did. So it's interesting because at the moment we've got a guy like Trump in the United States who does some good things and bad things. But if you speak to many, certainly in our media and many of our political class, they will tell you that it's all bad. There's no good. And it's interesting because what I'm seeing the same with Boris, who has said he will give them the Brexit they need, whether it be no deal or a deal that is adequate. These seem to be leaders who are willing to be unpopular, as you mentioned, who maybe they're not doing the right thing, but it would seem that they're willing to take their chances on what they believe is best for their country. And it's an interesting juxtaposition to me.
Well, they certainly do have the critical component of guts. And that is really important in politics. You can't be a shrinking violet and apologize for your existence every 5 minutes. That you can't do. But let me just go back to this notion of race against time, because it is the idea that you mentioned initially, and I completely agree with you. We are in a race against time. The big dilemma for the DA, and it was a huge dilemma when I was the leader as well, is do you participate in that race and pander to some elements of populism to broaden your base artificially quickly? Or do you say this is the politics of the long haul? And if people are going to come to the DA who are going to default to race and take positions compatible with our value set, we're going to have to deal with that systematically. So there is a difference between maintaining the value set that you know is absolutely critical for the country to succeed over the long term, non-racialism, the rule of law, meritocracy, and all of those things, and saying how much, for example, do you dabble in the politics of race, and when are you crossing a line that you can't get back from, and to what degree, in having to recognize the incredible injustices of the past, do you make it impossible to build a just future, an inclusive future, a growing economy? So these are enormous dilemmas, and we've had such discussions around them within the party. And I have to admit that I was the one who said we're in a race against time. It was under Jacob Zuma. I said we cannot tolerate the continuation of this radical economic transformation, white monopoly capital debate that will truly destroy South Africa's economy and leave 20 million people unemployed. So we're in a race against time. And then you do a whole range of things that probably in ideal situations you wouldn't have to do. So these are unbelievably difficult in the world of realpolitik. You know, I'm a classical liberal, and I hope I'm a very idealistic one. But I've also had the challenge of having to lead a political party and try to grow it, and having to run a coalition. And you soon begin to distinguish between when to hold onto a principle and when to adjust a strategy or tactic. And these are very, very complex decisions. So that's the first thing that the point I want to make. And you don't always get them right. I used to say we've got to drive in this race against time. I'm now more on the point of saying, let's rather accept what we mean by the politics of the long haul. But it's very difficult to find the line between it. Then, as far as the NHI, well, the NHI, if it's introduced, is going to be the ESCOM of health. There's no question about that. Obviously, we do want decent healthcare for everybody. And I'm delighted every time I go to Grootskeur, the last time was yesterday, to see people and to chat to people, at the incredible quality of service that Grootskeur offers, that the George Public Hospital offers, that the Knysna Public Hospital offers. I am just so incredibly impressed, despite the unbelievable pressures. And of course, the Red Cross Children's Hospital is world class, absolutely world class. So there's no point in introducing the NHI until we've got a world class public health system. And if you've got a world class public health system, you don't need the NHI. And the critical point is that you cannot take away people's choice in a free society. If people are paying their taxes, they can choose to get healthcare where they like. And so the bottom line is that it's going to be a total disaster. And all we can do is keep warning about it and warning about it and fighting it and fighting it. I mean, ultimately, we will be proved to be right, as we have been about Jacob Zuma. We said stop Zuma in 2009. I was called racist. A poster said stop Zuma, and people said, "Oh no, it's only because he's black and this and that." When I criticized him heavily for when he was the head of the AIDS Council and having all these relationships, even with a woman that he knew was HIV positive and allegedly raped her, but he was found not guilty on that charge. And I was critical about it. The entire society came thundering down on me for 3 months. You can't believe. And I mean, now what I said about Jacob Zuma in retrospect was tame compared to what the general consensus about Jacob Zuma's presidency was. Then they elected him a second time, despite the fact that we all knew this stuff. And now people blame the whites for the crisis in South Africa. Meanwhile, I think a very significant proportion of white people voted to stop Zuma at that point. Obviously, brown people and black people did as well. And so you can't generalize on the basis of race. But the bottom line is that you've got to keep arguing your point, and no one will ever give you credit for being right. They'll always move on to the next point and tell you why you're wrong. The reason why Reagan is considered in history to have been a good president, I think, is because he had one critical gift. He surrounded himself by really good people, I think, who gave him good advice. I don't think he was a genius, but I think he listened to good advice. And he had another quality which I respected hugely. Even though I sometimes knew that he didn't know what was going on by what he said, he always looked on top of the situation. He always looked as if he was completely confident, in the saddle and in charge. And that makes an enormous impact on an electorate. He always was in charge, never flustered, always on top of it, or apparently on top of it. And I think those two gifts really were the bearers of his presidency.
Well, I think I agree with you on everything there, and I'm glad that you say that. You made mistakes. It seems like it's very difficult for politicians to understand that they're humans too, and we can go into those mistakes. I don't really care at the moment for that, but it is refreshing to hear that maybe you took a populist stance in the hope that it will lead to a greater good. So in a utilitarian sense, it does make sense in that regard. But I mean, two fundamental questions from me. The state of the DA going forward. What are your thoughts about that? I know that you remain a member and that you will stay within the structure somehow. And number two, the tax revolt. You had a very good idea by the tax revolt. Then you actually wrote about it, and I thought it was a terrible solution, which was to invest in like high risk tech companies. But now Solidarity has taken on that mantle about on the tax revolt and want to ensure that the state is starved of its funds. And I think that's a very legitimate cause at the moment, because once you starve them, they can't actually implement anything at all. But firstly, yes, let's go back. The state of the DA and the future of the DA and the tax revolt. Do you still agree with the tax revolt, generally speaking? And do you think there are other ways to do it other than investing in high risk tech startups?
Right. Well, what I really don't want to talk much about the future of the DA because I'm not the leader and I'm not in any part of any DA structure. I'm just an ordinary member of a branch, and I'll do my best to contribute to that branch in the way that every branch member is expected to do. So I will do that. And I suppose I could comment on the state of the DA just like any other branch member, but I'm not seen to be any branch member. I'm seen to be the ex-leader of the DA. And every time I open my mouth, even if it is to understand the dilemmas that the current leader, Musi Maimane, faces, people will give it a twist of Zille criticizes Maimane and Zille says this and Zille says that. And it really frustrates me. I mean, there was a very good letter in the Business Day from somebody called Sydney Kay the other day, reflecting precisely on this in a speech that I'd given to the press club, in which I was very nuanced in analyzing whether or not the DA should have taken Cyril Ramaphosa to the public protector, given all the dilemmas that we face around the compromised nature of the current public protector. And it was presented in the Business Day as me flying into Musi, which I really didn't do at all.
All right, mate, I'll give my stance on the DA and then you can not respond to it. I think it's been poisoned by identity politics. And I think Musi is probably a lovely guy to have a beer with, but is unaware or ignorant of the NDR and what the ANC's long-term plans are. And I think there's been a large rush of new blood into the party who are actually ANC members at the core or social democrats at best. And they find, classical liberalism as some sort of, old white man's club. And, for the future, we need to be socially democratic and not classically liberal. So I think there's a lot of tension between different factions, for lack of a better word, within the DA. And I just see stagnation going forward unless there's a real sense of leadership. But unfortunately, I don't think Mr. Maimane is the leader to do that.
All right. I assume Helen's going to stay silent on that.
Well, I was talking.
I would like to talk on one point. I would like to talk on one point. The role of our universities is going to be something that is looked back on with some grave concern in the future. Because instead of providing a platform where paradigms can clash, where people can debate different issues, where subjects are taught from different perspectives and people understand them from first principles, there's a kind of hegemony, a stifling hegemony of thought around identity politics. And when I've analyzed it, I've understood that university humanities faculties have always prided themselves on being on the left, When I was there, it was strongly Marxist, and everything was Marxist, and you weren't progressive unless you were a Marxist. And I had a lot of battles with people at the time in those universities around Marxism being progressive. I thought it was highly retrogressive and would lead to the economic collapse of the country. Because in many countries with flourishing universities, and especially flourishing humanities faculties, the economic growth in liberal democracy has, in fact, led to unknown prosperity, the Marxist analysis has faded and has been replaced by the politics of racial identity and other forms of identity, gender, sexuality, and various other things. And so these faculties always have to see everything in a paradigm of the oppressor and the oppressed, and now it's on the basis of class, of race, gender, and sexuality. And to have this imported into South Africa at this time, primarily through our universities, has dealt a devastating blow to the concept of nation building, has divided South Africans into smaller and smaller competing units who are all fighting to be the most oppressed and the most intersectionally disadvantaged, and the one that you can't say anything bad about or offend in any way. It's taken away one of the fundamental rights that we have, which is the right to free speech. And suddenly the right not to be offended has trumped the right to free speech, which is really, really dire for any society. And then you have a situation where many of those young people come in and join the DA and understand that that is the way of the world. They have never been exposed to another way of thinking. And this is a huge challenge. And we've tried to develop the Young Leaders Program to help deal with that, but obviously very few people can enter that. And when you have the notion of an oppressed identity group versus a privileged identity group take hold of a society as a whole, then to say that ideas around how economies grow and how jobs are created are more important than that divide is a very, very difficult thing to get across.
Yeah. Sorry, Jonathan. I had two questions there. I agree with you, and I think you sort of tacitly agree with me on one point I made earlier. But on to the next one, the tech revolt in specifically. It's something I agreed with you once you started tweeting about it and created the narrative around it. Still a legitimate form of protest? Still something that you advocate? And if so, in what manner?
Well, tax revolts are very, very much the order of the day in South Africa. I think the major leader of the tax revolt in South Africa, for very bad reasons, was Jacob Zuma. It is well known that throughout his entire presidency, he never once filled in a tax form. And you think all of these millions that were handed over to him, or to people like Dudu Myeni, who was the chair of SAA, and to a range of other people as revealed before the Zondo Commission, do you think they ever declared that money and paid tax on it? The entire ANC elite is massively involved in a tax revolt. These alleged millions that came to Cyril Ramaphosa and his campaign, were they ever declared? I mean, these are critical questions. So the extent of tax evasion, not legitimate tax avoidance, but tax evasion is absolutely endemic. And it is a critical question in South Africa. And it is very irritating for legitimate taxpayers to hear consistently and all the time that they need to pay taxes, whereas the power hierarchy that's making billions corruptly isn't. Do you think that the Guptas pay tax? Do you think that that whole power network paid tax? Now, those of us who are always absolutely loyal and disciplined taxpayers, and then you hear that kind of submission to the Zondo Commission that, for example, Agritzi made, you start thinking, what the hell is going on here? And how do we call these kinds of corrupt individuals to account? We're going into an election. The election is likely, and it indeed did produce the result, of electing back exactly the same government that was party to all these malpractices. So what do you do to get accountability into the system? And accountability means if you steal people's money, you are held accountable to that normally in democracies by being voted out of office. Now, if that core accountability mechanism does not work, where do you go? I like the idea very much at local level in particular to start that. And for every ratepayer who is not getting piped water, who is not getting electricity reticulation, where sewage is running down the streets, where rubbish is not being collected, to say, let's pool our resources and privatize those services. So we continue to pay, but the private sector runs those services and we pay for the services and we get those services. Now, apparently, and I've researched that quite a lot, there is a court case precedent that says you are not allowed to privatize at the local level, which seems bizarre because how can you be not allowed to privatize when you're paying money to a local government for a service that is taking your money and, for example, investing it in VBS and not getting any services? How can you say then, I can't use my money to get the services to which I'm entitled? There's a fundamental contradiction there. So I'm not for 1 minute suggesting that people shouldn't pay for their services or shouldn't pay. I'm suggesting that they should be powerful to demand the services they get for what they pay.
Helen, I feel like we're maybe 2 steps away from saying taxation is theft, which would be a completely correct assertion.
I think people in society need to pay tax because there are things that people collectively need, and I think that a capable state should be providing them, and I would argue very strongly for a capable state, and I worked very hard to try and achieve one when I was the Premier.
Yeah, I mean, we hashed out the capable state last time we had a chat. My only assertion would be, okay, you can aim for your capable state and I'm going to aim for my not paying you for services I don't get until you have your capable state, which in Joburg, which I might add, run by the DA, would mean currently I would pay for water, a little bit for electricity, and pretty much for nothing else, based on the service. But so that's a problem across the community. I want to get back to this idea of our universities and really what's infusing I suppose popular culture, what's infusing politics, the people who have ended up in the newsrooms, the people who are writing the columns in newspapers and online, certainly the people who run social media accounts and are running networks like Twitter and Facebook.
And all the bots, don't forget them.
The woke crowd. I don't know that the bots are woke. I think the bots are Russian, but the sort of the wokeness, and I think it's a very important point, because we can joke about being woke and all of that, but you mentioned the result it's having, for example, on the DA. People go into university, they do a BA degree, which probably would have been standard entry for a politician, and has been for decades, if not since the turn of the last century. And now they come out of these sort of BA programs, and they come with very little ability of what you would expect from a BA. So those that was always kind of, there were lots of jokes around BAs, but there was also a sort of tacit respect that a BA was about thinking, and it was about being able to take different points of view and kind of meld stuff together and come out with the best idea of the way you think the world should work. And as you mentioned, a lot of these people have no idea how the world works or want to default. Yeah, so do I. The problem is now it's a very different system. That system is based on oppression. But what I think is important is, we were talking about the Constitution earlier and all the sort of elements that come off it. We have, as you know, gotten to the point that we are trying to redefine words. So, for example, racism. Some people would say from the woke crowd that if you're white, you're racist. You can be racist. If you're black, you can't be racist, for example. They would make those kinds of arguments. We've seen this play out in our real everyday life when people get taken to human rights commissions and all kinds of things like that. If you're white and you say something abhorrent to a black person, you might get thrown in prison for 3 years. If you're black and you say something abhorrent to a white person, nothing happens to you or a slap on the wrist. I just wonder if you see as much danger, not just in how it affects, say, the DA and other political parties, but how it's sort of seeping into our courts and our legal system?
Look, it's extremely, extremely dangerous. And I've got the scars to prove it. I mean, people can say far worse things than I've ever said analytically. And, even if almost every single historian except Frantz Fanon agrees with my analysis, the fact that I'm white causes an unbelievable furor. And it's just, the code is, if you're black, you can say things. If you're white, you can't say things. And that fundamentally undermines the core notion of our Constitution of freedom of speech and everyone being equal before the law. And that's why we have to stand up and fight for these things. It's unpopular. You need to have a bit of a backbone to do so. But if we don't, then we lose absolutely everything over time. The least tolerant and the most oppressive get to control society.
Sorry, just repeat that last sentence. The least what?
The least tolerant and the most oppressive get to control society.
Well, I mean, that's essentially what politics is. It's a power game, right? And a liberal, personally speaking, I think liberals are actually quite timid in a way. They sort of think that these ideas are self-evident to most people, and when they really are bloody well not. And I'm being very polite. I normally swear quite a bit on this podcast, but they are not.
I'm supposed to be going on a radio show now because we've lost a little bit longer. Let me just hold on. Hi there. Do you want to put me on the radio? Do you want to put me on the radio now? Sorry, guys. In the next minute. Okay. Can you phone me in the next 2 minutes? I've just got to finish a live stream. Is that okay? Please phone me in the next 2 minutes. Okay, I'm so sorry. Okay, please call me in the next 2 minutes. Okay.
So we've got 2 minutes, Helen, to wrap it up.
That's definitely staying in the podcast, just by the way.
No edit whatsoever. Good. Okay, so just to wrap it up, you are with the IRR now, and I'm very glad about that. I assume we'll be seeing some of your writing as well come through their Daily Friend platform. And what are you looking to achieve in the next, say, year?
Well, what I've been trying to achieve my whole life, making South Africa work as a democracy. And it can only be done on the basis of a capable state, the rule of law, a culture of accountability, non-racialism, and a market economy. And that's the only way South Africa can succeed. I have analyzed it from every point of view, and I can't see how it can succeed any differently. And I will fight for those values till I draw my last breath.
And what is nice about the IRR, because I know them quite well by now, they actually don't care what you tweet. So you can
They don't care what I tweet. They believe in freedom of speech and they will defend it. And they can recognize a bot when they see it. And they can recognize manufactured outrage when they see it.
Right. I can't wait for Unhinged Godzilla to, be unleashed onto the South African scene. Yeah. It's going to be amazing. Helen, always thank you. Sorry for cutting it short. I hope your radio interview goes well. And we really, really appreciate you coming on. And no doubt we'll hear from you very soon in the future.
It's such a pleasure. And thank you very much, Ramon.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Jonathan.
Cheers.
Bye.
Speak soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay, Ramon, we can talk a little bit. I don't know if you want to deal with some of the people in the comments. They were probably wanting to ask Helen questions, but we ran out of time there. But we do have another.
Sorry, chaps. Mainstream media still takes preference over us after all these years, and we're going to change that hopefully very soon.
Yeah, bloody radio stations. I think that's one of the more epic moments on on the podcast ever. Or on the live stream as well. You want to do some final stuff before we take a break and then come back for the Zubi?
Well, from my side, I am completely shocked, like our president, that after implementing a national minimum wage, accelerating BE, taking away property rights, and sending the army to the Cape Flats, and a few other things, that unemployment is up. I'm actually baffled as to why this has happened. And I think what we actually need now is actually a higher minimum wage and a more effective and broad-based BE policy to bring it down again. It's sort of like,
I agree with you, but what I would add,
vaccination. We just haven't had enough vaccination. We only did like half a squirt of the needle. We need to do the full one first.
What I would add, though, Ramon, is that the state should control all the pensions because they know how to invest that money best. As they are trying to do. We'll have Magnus Haystack on to speak about that. And then they should probably take over your healthcare to the point that even if you had the money, which you won't anymore, but even if you did, you wouldn't be able to consult a doctor without asking the government for permission. I think that'll solve the problem. I really do.
Well, I think, our benevolent overlords know what's best for us, in the same way that King Louis XVI knew what was best for his peasants, in the same way that a lot of the other, totalitarian dictators thought that they knew best what to do with their people before they got hanged and, testicles got cut off and shoved in their dead mouths. These sort of things end in tragedy. And unfortunately for us, it looks like the tragedy will be us and not them particularly.
Well, eventually it will be them. I'm not sure this ends well for whoever's left in government when there's no healthcare left, there's no food left on the shelves. I'm not convinced we have a military quite as strong as Venezuela to suppress the masses in the streets. I don't think it ends well, and I think we will have our Marie Antoinette eventually. Just to speak about these sort of recent issues that have come up, the ANC really does seem to be doubling down on pretty much everything. There doesn't seem to be any pullback whatsoever. I mean, this is my point to Helen, right? I mean, she's optimistic, and perhaps if you wait long enough for that to come to fruition, we all end up in a far better place. The problem is I'm not seeing it, given how much they're accelerating their program. I don't know if you feel like we've almost hit the gas on a lot of the ANC NDR stuff. It's felt like it was rolling for a while, but now we're really pushing.
Well, yes, I mean, it rolled a lot under Zuma, and the problem with Zuma is he was a figure that attracted so much media attention that the SACP were in the background amending legislation, introducing new legislation. Rob Davies and Ibrahim Patel put in really nefarious and difficult regulation to everyday life, and they got away with a lot of it. If you look at what BE regulations there were, they're cutting out of trade deals, or rather not cutting out, cancelling trade deals with the rest of the world. Even the EU said BE is a little bit too much now, Rob. Maybe you should let it go. And he refused to do that. But now I think it's a lot more overt. And I think that Cyril, I disagree with him. I think Cyril actually knows very well what he's doing. And if EWC and the NHI is what keeps the ANC together, that's what he will do, irrespective of the costs. As long as the ANC is in power till Jesus comes, which I heard is in Kenya, by the way. I don't know if you've seen that meme. Until Jesus comes, the ANC will remain in power, because the ANC are not a political party.
Jesus is in Kenya.
Yes, don't you see there was a pastor who had like a white guy dressed like Jesus parading around in a Range Rover? So hopefully he's on his way down here.
In a Range Rover. He's traded in the donkey for something a little bit better,
It's 2019, dude. It's time to get on with the thing. What was I going to say? Yeah, so I think Cyril will destroy the country to unite the ANC.
A couple of quick things here. What do we think about the army coming to the Cape Flats? We've said it on a previous podcast, but generally a bad idea. Arm
people. Don't bring the army in. Let people have guns to defend themselves, and then you'll see the way things change.
The only caveat I made was, well, when you basically castrate the police force to such an extent, this will be almost a natural progression. And even some of the people will support it, because they'll say, well, if the police are essentially useless, maybe bring in someone that can do something, but it's still a terrible move. And then there's this thing about this shooting group, I think focused at black people mainly. I think it's literally called a Black Forum or something like that, and they want to do firearm training or whatever. I'm not particularly bothered by it. I think lots of groups get together, and you do on a relatively regular occasion.
Yeah, you're not supposed to tell people that, Jesus. How are we
We're
supposed to have a revolution if you tell people we're having a revolution, Jonathan?
we're
Fuck
friendly
that.
with GOSA and Gun Owners of South Africa, and they regularly have shoots where they invite people that are part of their organization and people who aren't. Look, guys, you need to support gun ownership even for those you disagree with. As long
Absolutely.
as they aren't taking your guns away, where's the issue? And if you're uncomfortable because it's a whole bunch of black people getting together shooting weapons, well, maybe they don't feel comfortable when a whole bunch of white people get together and shoot weapons. But if it's meant to be a free country, then there shouldn't be a problem with that either way. I think if it comes down to an incitement of violence thing, and specifically like we're training with the purpose of killing X people, then it becomes a worrying issue.
Well, that was left vaguely on the pamphlet that I saw. It was like we weren't get ahead through law. We'll get ahead through violence.
Yeah.
And so it was sort of, there was a tinge of like, we're using this training to actually proceed with a political aim, which is
I think we need to be careful though, because I've seen 3 different sort of screenshots, and they all sort of said similar things, but some were obviously more violent and collectivist, and others were just kind of, we're getting together to kind of do this as a group who are proud of our identity. So as I say, I'm perfectly fine with a group who are proud of their identity getting together to do whatever they like, including fire weapons. But obviously, if it becomes a violent thing, but I think we need to be careful of fake news, essentially.
Yeah, well, it's difficult to tell what is fake and what is not. But I just want to juxtapose this with Malcolm X. So Malcolm X, black nationalist, and he said, "Listen, chaps, you're a black man in America. Get a gun, arm yourself, and if someone tries to harm you in any way, shoot them dead." Context, though, America was deeply racist. Jim Crow laws were all over the place. Black people were not treated as equal citizens, and there was a high percentage of black Americans who were treated very poorly by the police. So Malcolm X was the first guy to say that let's use the Second Amendment for us and let's defend ourselves from state coercion. Difference is black people were a minority and still are in America under quite an oppressive and racist system in the South and in the North too, but more so in the South. Locally, you are in the majority with political power. Every aspect of the state is black. The president, the chief justice, not the head of SARS anymore, but a lot of people in important institution positions are black African, which is fine. So I don't see what the danger is that they're trying to sort of fight against. No doubt they will create one. But listen, if you want to be black and you want to join a black shooting club and no whites allowed and you want to pay 400 Rand for 30 rounds of bullets, go ahead. I just take video because I want to see the obstacle course when someone falls off, because that's going to be really funny. But just go ahead. I don't think we should be worried about this sort of thing. And if you are worried, go to the shooting club, get your own gun, and make sure you defend yourself. I think it's as simple as that.
Look, this also goes back to the freedom of speech argument and the freedom of expression argument for me. It depends how far you go down this road. You and I are both pretty much free speech absolutists. There are a lot of restrictions in this country which were made by the one side, and then because the one side made them, the other side said, well, okay, fine, if you want to follow those rules, we'll push the same sort of rules. But the reality is, if you believe in the individual and you don't believe in collectives, then even if someone is saying we should get together to shoot so that we can take back our land, an individual that then goes and decides to shoot someone to take back their land is still the individual committing the crime, is still the individual at fault, and it was still the individual choice to do that. So I know this is a large debate because a lot of people feel that there's ability to incite violence, but you must understand that you do exactly what the left does by taking away agency from people. When you say, well, if Julius Malema says X and one of the people in the crowd then goes and does it, that's Julius Malema's direct influence, and Julius Malema is responsible. I think there is responsibility there of some sort, but I do still think ultimately it comes down to the individual. But that's obviously this broad debate. I mean, when we've had Mark on the show, we've discussed this quite extensively. Mark Oppenheimer, obviously an expert on all this free speech stuff.
Yeah, quite. And I'm actually in favor of people coalescing around shared interest and doing whatever the hell they want, as long as they don't harm others. If they do harm others, well, shoot first, really, and that's it. Train better. All right. Jonathan, I'm going to be off. I want to take a quick break. We got Zuby on at 10 p.m. Yes,
Yeah.
you're lucky. We got someone else. We got the female powerlifting British champion.
Yes, world. She's the world powerlifting champion.
No, British. Go look at the tweet again. It was the British powerlifting record, not the world.
Well, then I think we should challenge him on the show to become the world female powerlifting champion.
While he's talking to us. While he is talking to us, she can become the world powerlifting champion. I think that's a phenomenal thing. We should live stream from the gym. But anyway, thank you for joining us. This was very haphazard. I'm sorry. Helen left in circumstances we weren't expecting, but that's what life is. Thank you so much for joining us. Give us money. renegadereport.co.za/report. Every time I say the URL, you laugh, and people don't hear it. That's why we get no money. All right.
That is not why we get no money. But say it again. I'm going to leave you to say it. Say it loud.
renegadereport.co.za/support-us.
Okay. Now everyone's got it. Now, of course, the money will just roll in, and we'll get lots of support. Otherwise, you cheapskates can just keep watching us for free, and we'll see you next time. Thanks so much for listening and watching. Cheers.
Cheers.